year. Wednesday, the need for government and political reform is so much in need at the national level. And here we are talking about it at the state and local level. But as it's been often said, all politics is local. And to believe in the democratic process, to believe in government, we need to have citizens believe in their governments. And so that's part of what the reform movement's all about. We're so pleased to have Catherine Turcer, the executive director of Common Cause Ohio, and my old friend, with us today. She doesn't have to wear a witch's hat. Sometimes we have these Halloween programs like the Horrors of Dark Money. But today we're going to be talking about both the reform agenda at the state level, and Catherine has a rather lengthy and huge and important agenda that Common Cause and groups like the League of Women Voters are pushing at the state level. But we also have our issues here in Cincinnati with the 3 bribery cases that have been prosecuted or been come up here with both parties of city council. And so what's often been referred to as one of the best governed cities in America now is besmirched by some kind of bad things happening here. So we have Jerry Newfarmer, former city manager and also currently the president of Community or Partners Associated, a consulting firm, with us to talk about some potential reforms at the local level. And we have former Congressman, former Mayor David Mann with us to further that discussion. But we're going to lead off, I think, with Catherine, because she has a rather lengthy agenda. As you know, we've been through this major happening at the state level with First Energy, Larry Householder, and that whole scandal. And that's still got to be cleaned up. We've got redistricting reform on the table, with Ohio faced with the first redistricting under 2 new constitutional amendments that passed in 2015 and 2018. And Catherine wants to make sure that those go right. So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Catherine, to talk about these issues coming up.
Hi, everybody. I was really pleased to be invited to come and talk with you all today, mostly because I think we're in a position right now where we are feeling the consequences of dark money, the consequences of not having the kind of transparency that we need, and we're sitting at home watching rioting at the nation's capital, and it can feel really difficult to imagine, like, well, what is it we can do, and how can we figure out the best way to move forward? And I don't know about you, but in the summer when Larry Householder, Speaker of the House, was arrested, in connection to a $60 million bribery racketeering scandal involving all sorts of dark money and pass-throughs, I thought, oh, this is the perfect moment. We're going to get moving. We're going to do something about dark money. This is the perfect opportunity. And a few bills were introduced, but Larry Householder got reelected. And one of the whistleblowers, a guy named Dave Greenspan, who's from up in the Cleveland area, he lost his election. And we're at a point where we really need to be thinking really systemically and holistically about the challenges that we face. And yet we also need to be really aware of how things are all interconnected and the ways that state and local government are connected and the challenges are connected. Okay, so since Householder and 4 of, dare I say, his henchmen were arrested, 2 of them have pled guilty, so that happened in October. And other kinds of things have been coming out. For example, we now know that Governor DeWine requested that First Energy spend some independent expenditure money, or basically do some political spending to support his daughter Alice's campaign. Now that campaign did fail, but when the governor of the state, during a time that they were discussing a major bailout totaling $1.5 billion, and the law is, shall we say, a little murky on this. There are anti-coordination rules, but they're not so strong as to say that family members can't do the ask. We need to remember that in Ohio, we have families that are actively engaged in, politics at all sorts of different levels. For example, the governor also has a son who is on the Ohio Supreme Court. So making sure that we address anti-coordination rules is really clearly needed. Now, the other thing that we discovered this month is that dark money from First Energy was used to attack Cleveland Public Power. And this is far from you, but at the local level, First Energy was using dark money to prop up what's called Cleveland Illuminating Electric, and to push back and make it much more difficult for the city-owned power to actually operate. And so, when we think about just how insidious dark money is, I do want to take us back, because some of us will be like, oh, this is a relatively recent occurrence. And yet, Citizens United was decided on December 21st, 2010. So we have been living with the consequences of dark money for nearly 11 years, almost exactly. And the thing that I wanted to highlight here is that at the time that Citizens United was decided, and it said that corporations have First Amendment rights, and we can have a whole conversation about how ludicrous it is for entities that are not humans to have First Amendment rights. But at the time, the majority of the court said, hey, we should have really good disclosure, that disclosure is constitutional. But at the state level, at the federal level, they have not done the things they need to do to actually get good disclosure of all political spending. And we know that in 2010, dark money was used to change the Ohio House, which had a Democratic majority. Armin Budish was the Democratic leader of the Ohio House at that point. That dark money was used by Project Red Map, and so we're talking about 2010, to get state legislators in so that there would be majorities of Republicans in both chambers, so that they could draw district lines that would favor the Republican Party. And so Project Red Map targeted a number of states, not just Ohio. They went after North Carolina, and they went after Pennsylvania, they went after Wisconsin, and they were very robust gerrymanders. And they're so robust that we have been living with the consequences ever since. We send year after year, cycle after cycle, 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats to DC to represent us. And so, when we got through the past election, so I'm moving us up to the householder scandal. When we had that summer and early fall, and there were bills introduced, but there didn't seem to be the momentum to not just repeal House Bill 6, which they, by the way, still have not done, but also there wasn't the momentum to say, okay, we actually need to establish rules so that Ohioans are not completely taken advantage of. And so we started this process of saying, okay, well, what are the kinds of things that are small things that could really make an enormous difference? And so clearly, and when I say small, they're still going to be incredibly challenging to do. They are changes to the amount of transparency and access to information that we have, so that we have the tools to influence the process in a better way. And so the first reform that we've been focusing on is the Jim Siegel Disclosure Bill. So the Jim Siegel Disclosure bill focuses on something that happened 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the Legislative Service Commission, which these are the people that provide writing services, they provide research to legislators, they essentially help craft legislation. And 20 years ago, there was a little bit of a scandal. When Roy Ray essentially gave a bill from First Energy and submitted it as his own, and also didn't admit that he had a consulting contract with First Energy. So like utility power at the State House has been going on for a really long time. And as opposed to addressing that 20 years ago, what they did is that they made it more difficult for us to understand what was happening at the State House by making it so that we no longer would have access to the records of the Legislative Service Commission. Now, Jim Siegel was a Columbus Dispatch reporter. He died in 2019. He was 44. Lovely, lovely person. And he was just this like tremendous advocate for robust disclosure and the need to get information. He was also really interested in like connecting the dots. And for those of you who are thinking about, okay, well, if we get access to who is researching and who is helping write the bills, we'll also get access to who, the kind of model legislation that is given to the joint, that is given to the Legislative Service Commission. So, and some of you might be thinking about ALEC or the American Legislative Exchange Council, or you might be thinking, oh, First Energy provided drafts. We now know that Sam Randazzo actually provided drafts also to the Legislative Service Commission. And we only know that because of an FBI investigation. And that should not be the case. So opening those records up so that we can follow, let's say, the sausage making all the way through the process is essential. I was a huge fan of Jim Siegel, and I continue to be, and I really believe that this is one of the ways that we can root out many, many different problems with all sorts of bill making. All right, so we need more transparency when it comes to lobbying and lobbying efforts. One of the things that we know is that during House Bill 6, First Energy first gave money to Partners for Progress, then gave money to Generation Now. Generation Now then ran ads, which we saw on television and we got in our mailbox, and suggesting that House Bill 6 was the best thing since sliced bread. We should be able to track that in fact, there should be a requirement that any of the money that is spent on lobbying is actually made available to the public so that we know who's actually making these kind of, the kind of spending. And so, the Campaign Legal Center is recommending that we push for any amount that's above $5,000 that pays for political ads. That would be mailers, radio ads, TV ads, etc. Because of course we can spend money pretty easily, running off flyers or whatever, and we want people to still be engaging in the kind of grassroots lobbying. But we should at some point have access to information about who is influencing the process and lobbying us to support legislation. Then, we've got, I talked a lot about the shining a light on dark money. I'm kind of, you can tell, moving along in this graphic. When we think about shining a light on dark money, it is super duper clear that we need to be able to understand who is influencing our elections. And that it would be great if we could not just have that information available at the Secretary of State's side, but that we would also have that information as we looked at an ad. And let's say we saw it on TV, or we're looking at a mailer. If we had the top 3 funders of the political advertisement on them, we could then consider the source of information. And so if we had received these mailers from Generation Now and it said top funder First Energy, you would be like, oh, it's an electric utility. Oh, they want the bailout. Now, many of us were able to make that connection, but to really clearly give the public meaningful disclosure would be wonderful. Also, we need to be thinking about the kinds of conflicts of interest that folks have that are on the Public Utilities Commission. We do know with Sam Randazzo, who resigned in November, we do know that he received a kind of mysterious $4 million payment from First Energy, essentially just as he was going on to the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Well, they are the regulators for electricity, and it literally does not make any sense. It's such an enormous conflict of interest. It was not required for him to disclose that he received this, though, because the money went to a nonprofit that he controlled. So we need to have good disclosure statements so that we understand not just the money that's like, hey, Sam, here's your money from First Energy, but that we understand the money, all the money that this is given to this entity that gives to that entity. So that if, for example, you had a consulting contract, that money that came from somebody who's going to be regulated would have to be disclosed upon requesting an appointment to the Public Utilities Commission, because we really, really need to root out those kinds of conflicts of interests. We should all be able to follow the money. Now, the other thing I wanted to highlight as we're kind of thinking about kind of the disclosure and outside information, we also need our legislators to be really clear where it is that they're getting their money. Many of them do some consulting, and consulting is a way that we will not have access to their client list. And clearly, we can think about not every single client, but the clients that are giving us a larger amount and a threshold completely makes sense. We should be able to understand who is attempting to influence our legislators and when they need to recuse themselves. And so, this is the kind of transparency wish list that goes through, and you might be looking at this saying, okay, this is really the state level. But if we start thinking about how is it at the local level that we can create better transparency so that there is not dark money in, city council races, for example, how can we make sure that we have as transparent a process when ordinances are created? This is a way for all of us, not just to kind of root out corruption, but also to become more active citizens and engaged citizens. And so that is a little bit about what I've been thinking about. And I kind of thought that maybe you would want to ask a few questions about this.
Good idea, Catherine. Questions out there?
So I know that lobbyists are often the ones who draft legislation and then hand it to the legislators. Do the lobbyists always have access to the LSC, even though the general public doesn't?
So the only people that are supposed to have access to the Legislative Service Commission at this point, the rules are that only legislators have access to them. Now, you've highlighted that we know that lobbyists are, in fact, writing the legislation the legislators then hand in. Now, one of the things that we do know is that it'll still take a little bit of detective work to figure out like where these things began. But at the moment, all we know is like kind of the rumors, and like occasionally a reporter will get, some little bit of information. I think we should be thinking about all the ways that we can make it more transparent, with an understanding that when you establish new rules, people will still be trying to think about ways to get around them. But we should make it as difficult as possible and also encourage accountability along the way. It's kind of like having the speed limit. It might be 55 and some people might go 60 or 65, but at least you're reining them in so they're not going 90.
Yeah. Thank you.
Catherine, you also have
behind you.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, Catherine, you also have a rather large agenda in terms of automatic registration and other things like the redistricting. Do you want to quickly go through that, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's happening here in Cincinnati, and then have a a general discussion about both.
So yes, so one of the things that we need to be really thinking about is how can we invite voters into the process? And we know that, Georgia really did some amazing things to get people engaged. We know that turnout in Michigan was significantly better than it is over here in Ohio. And we need to think about what are the kinds of reforms that we could put in place. And one of the reforms that is really powerful is what's called automatic voter registration, which would allow us to register to vote at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And you might say to yourself, well, wait a second, I already can do that. This would make it so that it would be automatic and automated in a way that information would then transition, you'd be doing it electronically, would then transition to the Secretary of State's office automatically. And other states have done this. That we've read about 25 states that have done this. So we're like halfway, like the halfway point is often this point that the state of Ohio will say, okay, there are enough states that have tried this thing out that we should consider it. And I do think it's exciting to think about how many more people we could actually get registered as they go and get state IDs, they go and get their driver's license. And then we could start thinking about other agencies. That's the next step to think about. We also need to be thinking about what's called, online absentee ballot applications. One of the things that we know is that it is an obstacle to a vote by mail if you have to fill out the form, and then they mail you the form, you fill out the form, you mail it back, then they mail you your ballot, and you then mail that back. Well, if in fact we could apply actually online, this would make a tremendous difference. Now, the other thing to think about this year, which is really, really connected to voting rights, has to do with the fact that this is 2021. I can't tell about the rest of you, but I feel like we have been waiting for this map making year for a really long time. We first passed state legislative redistricting reform in 2015. We will not be voting under new district lines until 2022. And so we've just been waiting a really long time, and this is it. Now, one of the things that we know is that map making is a bit complicated, that the reforms are not perfect. And so we will need to be really holding, the legislators' feet to the fire so that we have maps that represent us. So I threw into the chat function two different webinars. One is like a redistricting 101, which is absolutely everything that you might want to know about redistricting and how it's changed and what the rules are. And so I would encourage you, if you're available on the 19th, to do that. If you aren't available, you can actually sign up for the webinar, and you will be sent a video of it so that, if you can't participate at the time, you'll be sent a video. You'll also be sent the PowerPoint as well. And then on January 25th, we have a forum that's focused on community map making. So one of the things that we know, and especially for Hamilton County, this makes an enormous difference, is that if you can keep a district wholly in one county, meaning population-wise, if you can keep it wholly in one county, you're required to do so. Now think about what that would mean for Congress when it comes to Hamilton County. However, it can be a little bit complicated to figure out where you want to draw those lines. And, okay, if it's wholly in one county, you're still going to have to split somewhere. How do you make that choice? Well, we are going to be the census is coming a little bit later, and we're going to be in a process where we're doing community map making. And community map making focuses on what is your community, and spends time actually drawing the maps to think about, okay, this is my community. And the idea is to develop the data so that when it comes time to draw district lines, that map makers aren't just choosing, hey, I'm just gonna go this way, I'm just gonna lop off a section that's on the east side. I'm just not gonna worry about that. Instead, that they do it, we give them data so they can be thoughtful and say, okay, I want to do this in a thoughtful way. I want to make sure as much as possible that I'm keeping communities together, what could that look like? And what is, what are our communities? The training on the 25th is more interactive. We can still send you kind of, the video that you could watch. It'll be a little bit more interactive because it's a training on mapping software. One of the things that we do know is that the map making conversation works better when we have maps to engage our official map makers. So that's the Ohio Redistricting Commission, Governor, Auditor, Secretary of State, 2 members from the Ohio House, 2 members from the Ohio Senate. When you go and testify and you just say, well, I like to keep my community together, or I want to make sure we have fair maps. Well, that's good, but it isn't the same as being able to say, okay, I'd like to show you a map. If we're we want to keep this county whole in Hamilton County, I want to make sure that this specific district is not separate. This little area is not separated. It can be a really different kind of conversation if we're speaking in the same language as the map makers, which, is making maps. And so I'm actually really excited about this. And I think that the engagement during 2021 is really the kind of the fruition of the long-term fair districts, fair election effort, where, we pushed for state legislative maps, and then we collected signatures to push for congressional maps. State legislature got the message, and then we pushed to actually get congressional redistricting reform passed. Now it's up to us to actually implement them. Any other questions or things you'd like to know about Bill?
Well, I think we got lots of grist for a longer conversation. I'd like to bring in Jerry Newfarmer. Catherine, you mentioned a few things that might apply locally. And so we've got Jerry Newfarmer with us, the former city manager and consultant now on these issues, to talk a little bit about how he views reforming what's happened in Cincinnati. And we have former mayor and council member and David Mann with us as well. And then we'll get back and talk about all these issues together. Jerry, are you with us? Yes, there's Jerry. I want to turn.
It's got to unmute.
You have to unmute,
There
Jerry.
we go.
All right.
Unmuted now.
All right. Well, here he is, Jerry Newfarmer, our former city manager and a friend.
Thank you, Bill. And good to be with all of you, even virtually. And Catherine, I really enjoyed your presentation and your comments about reforms that ought to be done or are being done at the state level. You know, the interesting thing about self-government is it's a constant struggle to get it better and make it better and so on. And I always think as we go around the world telling other countries how to do how their government should work, that we got to look to ourselves very often, and that's what we're doing a little bit today. My focus, as Bill has suggested, is on city government. Cincinnati city government is by charter nonpartisan, and by practice it's partisan, but mostly non, more non than partisan, let's say, and it's certainly different at the local level than at the national or state level, where the partisan conflict that we see and live with is intense. It's not so much that way here at a local level. The immediate cause for concern is that good government seems to be out of whack in Cincinnati. We've had 3 council members indicted within the last year. And that's caused a lot of focus and attention on what's going wrong. What are the reforms how could that happen? Cincinnati has prided itself on having good government, all the way going back to 1925 when the city charter was adopted and the Boss Cox political machine was thrown out and good government was installed. Kind of the progressive reform movement come home here to Cincinnati. It has served the city well for 100 years or so since then, but it's been adjusted and tweaked from time to time. Changes have been made. And the changes that are made reflect the shifting of values. Something needs to be stressed that isn't, and so we need to rebalance the organism of self-government. That is our city council. In recent years, that rebalancing has revolved much around the role of the mayor. There were a couple of proposals in the late 90s, early 2000s to throw out the council manager form of government, which is what Cincinnati has had since 1925, and switch to a council mayor form with a strong mayor who is separate from the city council and is an executive. Those proposals were rejected by the voters. And subsequently, there was a charter amendment that was approved, the purpose of which was to strengthen the role of the mayor in his or her ability to provide political leadership in the city. And so to do that, there were several specific powers given to the mayor in the revised charter. And in the years that have passed since then, that has had its effects. And I think the current challenges facing the city reflect the balance getting a little bit out of whack. The solutions here are not so much passing new rules, but rather a question of balance and who has the responsibility and therefore the accountability for good performance. You know, in the council manager form of government, you've got a mayor and a city council that appoints a professional city manager who subscribes to a code of ethics to operate clean government on the basis of professional values, following a policy direction adopted by the board of directors, which is the mayor and the city council. With that kind of a setup, the emphasis very much is on ethical performance and quality work. The rebalancing that occurred to give the mayor more power, frankly, I was not involved at the time. My successor as city manager, John Shirey, didn't like the proposal and opposed it. I thought it was okay. I thought it was needed. We had a situation where council members were running off all over town, presuming to individually be the key decision makers in city government rather than acting as a group, which is the concept. And to strengthen the role of the mayor would give the mayor the political leverage with council members to have them come back together and work more effectively as a group. So I thought that those changes were a good thing. And seeing how they've played out especially in recent years, I think it's out of balance. That's my personal view of things. I mean, the immediate area of attention with the case of council members that have been indicted has to do with development proposals and development projects. But that's only part of the picture. That happens to be where a lot of the money is, and so that's where the chickens come home to roost. But it should be seen as a symptom rather than a cause, I think. You know, good government, the structural considerations of good government should be a balancing kind of thing. You know, as someone who works with doing consulting with local governments, I needed something to do after I was city manager in Cincinnati, so I set up a company called Management Partners, and we do and have for the last 20 years done consulting with local governments all across America. So we work in a lot of different settings, and in particular, I serve as the executive director of the Large Cities Executive Forum. So those are the larger cities in North America. So I've got some pretty good sense of what's going on in other places. And that's an important dimension to have. It's a balancing thing. Structural solutions by themselves don't solve problems, but they can drive outcomes. And so I think those kinds of considerations are important. Since we've suffered the shock of the indictment and arrest of community leaders and members of the city council, a number of council members have come forth with proposals for different kinds of reforms. By my count, there are at least 4 or 5 that have come forward. They will be considered in the context of local elections. In 2021, the city of Cincinnati will elect new members of council and a new mayor. And so that will happen at the same time that these other proposals will be on the table. I think it's important, if it can be done, to have reform proposals seriously considered in a way that emphasizes the good government value for the service to the community as a whole, rather than the political perspective of one individual or another. And to that end, the Seasongood Foundation, which was established by Murray and Agnes Seasongood to carry on their work of good government, which was started in 1925 with the city charter, will be issuing a request for proposals for someone or organization who, outside of the political sphere, can bring together all of the ideas that are being considered and evaluate them and get some people talking to one another in a depoliticized, hopefully, a kind of way. So that'll be an interesting dimension to watch how it develops. You know, it's really important that we emphasize the values of balance, that we emphasize the nonpartisan character of our community. The old axiom, there's no partisan way to fill a pothole. Cincinnati has had good government for a very long time, and that's because it's had a pretty good system. The city manager continues to serve as the CEO, even though the mayor, by default, has acted in that way. I chuckled a little bit when I heard the mayor in a press conference announce that the problem with Cincinnati city government is that the legislative branch needed reform. Well, excuse me, the mayor is the leader of the legislative branch in our form of government. It's not like the mayor is separate. And so having a good, thorough, depoliticized evaluation and determination about what kinds of reforms would be best for our city is an important thing to set up and to carry through. Right now, we're a little bit over politicized in some cases, I think. And of course, my passion is professional management, and that's a bias. But it's balance at the end of the day that's important. So those are some thoughts, Bill, to kick off this part of the conversation.
Well, good. Comments about Jerry's presentation, and we have former Mayor David Mann with us. Do you have any response to Jerry's commentary?
Sure. Jerry and I have talked about this a fair amount, and it's not the first time I've heard his thoughts, and I think he has heard some of my thoughts too, and I think he hit some important points. And there's still folks in this community, there are folks in this community that would like to see the city manager eliminated completely and go to a full executive mayor, which I don't agree with. I think the city manager system has served us very well. And on occasion, I do remind people, including John, that the city manager is still under the charter of the CEO of the city. And I say to him, there is some natural tension between the role of the mayor and the role of the city manager. And with the right personalities, that's okay. The city manager should be somebody whose career has been devoted to professional administration. Ideally, somebody who's had experiences in other parts of the world and knows that the way Cincinnati is doing it is not the only way to do it. And with the right person coming in as city manager, there's some value to not having a bunch of pre-existing relationships with the 5,000 plus city employees of the city, or for that matter, interest groups in the community. I've seen that work extremely well. Obviously, as Jerry suggests, the development process is something that is in the middle of the indictments that have taken place, and we are looking very closely at some proposals that would highlight the fact that development ideally would be negotiated in the first instance by the professionals, the city manager, the development department, and so forth, whose mission should be to work on achieving the goals of the city council. Now, the city council needs to clearly explain, articulate those goals. Obviously, economic development, employment opportunities, inclusion, sensitivity to environmental issues, and all the rest are an appropriate use of incentive tools such as tax abatement and such as direct appropriations of funds if public benefit that we wish is taking place, and engagement with community groups. And then ideally, and some of this is hard to accomplish chapter and verse in the real world, but ideally then the negotiated development comes to city council, who first checks to see have its processes been followed, what policies that is articulated have been achieved, and then says yes, no, or let's change it. And we have often had real timing difficulties in the sense that the administration says, here's the deal. There are all sorts of reasons why you have to act on it now. For example, next week, we're going to have a new proposal for development at Liberty and Elm and over the Rhine. I haven't seen it. I've heard about it a little bit. And the fact is that there are a lot of concerns in the community about it. And I think there's some expectation probably that council act on it next week. Our council meeting next week is Thursday because of the holiday. And when we're going to get the negotiated package that we can begin to responding to. Will it be before the weekend? I don't know. And I'm talking too long, but I think part of what Jerry was saying is we need to remember that we used to be truly the best governed city in the country. We used to be dedicated to professional management and nonpartisan government. We've gotten away from that. And as Jerry suggests, the semi-strong or a little bit strong mayor system presents the opportunity for folks who take advantage of building a career. And the worst thing sometimes for the city of Cincinnati is a younger elected official who has aspirations elsewhere that can be best served by personal success locally. And that's part of the complication. It's not unique to Cincinnati or necessarily unique to our form of government. So,
well, that's illustrative, David, of the tensions that exist within the system. One of the commitments that ought to be the case, and that there's no excuse to not have be the case, is transparency. And council ought never to be put in a position that you just described at the Liberty and Elm project of having a serious proposal come to the council without having a written staff report significantly in advance. In some cities that I'm familiar with, many, as a matter of fact, it's 2 weeks in advance. So it's in writing, it's on the table with the recommendations and the points that are made. The council today has very clear established policies for development. You have a development plan, you've got a code and ordinances that drive it. The rules of the game are established. It's only the really extraordinary proposals that require any kind of negotiation at all. The staff applies the policies, does a review of development proposal, establishes conditions consistent with the policy, writes it up and gives it to the council. That's the way it should work, and it has not been working that way. So that's a practical operational reform that ought to occur. But there may be others. And the one thing I do know is that there are lots of ideas on the table, and And all this is going to occur, for goodness sake, and David, you know this better than anybody, in the middle of an election season. So that makes it even more interesting.
Well, we've reached a point where we can open this up for a general discussion now. And I'll start it off by getting back to Catherine. You mentioned you've been talking about disclosure. Possibly we haven't gone far enough in terms of disclosure here, because we passed a charter amendment back in 2001 that had disclosure in terms of contribution limits, but with these new legal corporate Citizens United cases and things like that, it's opened it up to different ways of getting money filtered in. So that may be, what do you think about that, Catherine? Do you think there's possibility for further disclosure at the local level?
Well, I don't know if you noticed, you were catching me in the middle of a sneeze. My allergy has been happy lately. So I do think, one of the things that happens is that we need to keep adjusting our campaign finance rules to the changes that come about. That it's a little bit like the tax code that can go for years, but it needs to be adjusted. And, we need to be thinking about, the playing field in 2001 is not the playing field of today. And so we do need to have good disclosure of independent expenditures or the political spending that is theoretically not coordinated with the candidates. And so I would encourage you to think about, where are the gaps that are part of the charter.
Catherine's got many issues in terms of the automatic registration and the redistricting too. Any questions? Let's open it up in terms of that role. My question about redistricting, since I was involved in the 2010 and almost got laughed off the stage at a public hearing when we had a very gerrymandered process of redistricting, but we've passed these two amendments. Do you think even without citizen involvement, things will be better because these two amendments passed, charter or constitutional amendments?
So if we all decided that we wanted to just let the official map makers do their thing, it would still be better than what we have right now. So there are rules, for example, that say if you can keep, a district wholly in a county, well, then you have to. And so that means, for example, you could in Hamilton County be creating a real opportunity district for a Democrat. You at minimum are creating a much more competitive district right in Hamilton County. You also wouldn't have districts. Let's take somebody like Jim Jordan, who we're all kind of aware of his recent actions and some of the kinds of things that he gets up to. Well, he is really in a super sweet district that looks like a duck. And it starts in Lorain County on Lake Erie, and it works its way, so the bill's up there in Lake Erie, and it works its way so that the tail feathers are actually in Mercer County, which is almost directly north of Cincinnati on the Indiana border. It's just kind of insane, the kind of districts that were created. And so those are not going to be possible. It wouldn't be possible to do Marcy Kaptur's district that works its way, from Toledo to Cleveland. And so we will have better community representation because there are rules about keeping political subdivisions together.
David, you look like you're ready to respond. Keep these questions coming. Yeah, Elizabeth Brown.
Hi, I'm talking about the Cincinnati situation. I guess I'm getting frustrated and tired of just rearranging and restructuring the city and, council and mayor and who's in charge. It seems like we expend a lot of time and effort doing that. I think we've talked here about the problems that we've had with the indictments about the two major issues, one of which is the development process and the other of which is the campaign finance issues and whether or not Cincinnati needs to do more to tighten that up. And I really personally would wish that we would spend our time and efforts looking at those issues rather than once again getting into a debate about the structure. And we seem to be tweaking it every couple of years and spending a lot of time and effort doing that. And I don't see that that's where the problem is. And I particularly, Mr. Newfarmer, would like your response to that.
I appreciate the comment, and it seems like that's exactly what we've been doing, just tinkering with the structure. And the push for the structure changes has always been for a stronger mayor, to have allegedly an accountable political leader. And the voters rejected a strong mayor system and said we prefer to have a council manager system, and that's what was kept. What's happened, actually it's a combination of two things. One is that we strengthened the role of the mayor, that's fine. But at the same time, the council over time forfeited its role, its leadership role in actually involvement in key policy issues. And the key to that is something that's has been way below the radar. And that is that the council no longer does executive sessions. The council used to, under state law, and back when I was city manager in the early 90s and the years before that, the council was permitted to hold executive sessions with the city manager and the professional staff on 4 specific types of issues to provide policy direction. So if there's pending litigation, somebody sued the city and the city attorney wants to make a settlement, city solicitor wants to settle the case, that would be discussed with the council in executive session so that the attorney could then go out and represent the city. The same thing's true with respect to labor negotiations with employee unions, and importantly, with respect to the performance of council appointees. Well, the city lost a lawsuit in the mid-90s sometime, and it was held in court that the city could no longer have executive sessions because there was not an express provision in the city charter that permitted it, even though it was permitted under state law that had been the basis of it for years and years and years. So the mayor at the time, on behalf of the council, said, well, okay, we'll never do executive sessions again. We'll do everything in public. Well, what's happened in the 30 years since is that all power has migrated to the office of the mayor, because council members can no longer talk to staff and provide direction about development deals or provide direction about labor negotiations. You recall a couple of years ago, on the brink of an election, when the mayor came into the city council and said, we're going to give the police a big pay raise, 5% a year for 3 years. Well, the mayor was up for re-election, and that's why he did it. The council had no involvement in that. It was a very bad policy decision at the time because the city had already done labor negotiation deals with all the other unions at 3%. This is just one example. But not having the right to participate in an executive session has been a significant impediment. That has changed. We got the charter amended about 2 or 3 years ago to restore the right for the city council to have executive sessions and to re-involve itself in these important policy questions, which otherwise have just been ceded over time to the office of the mayor. So the mayor does it all. So this development deal that David mentioned that's going to come into the council next week, that's not coming from the staff. Probably that's probably coming from the mayor, because all that power has just moved over to the mayor in spite of the way the charter is written. It doesn't have to be that way. And the council, if it it began the practice of involving itself in these important policy questions, can rebalance the government, which is why that is a structure question, Elizabeth, and your question is very well taken. But it has to do with who does what and how things actually work. And so that's what my focus is, and that's why I talk about the importance of balance.
Peter?
Oh,
Peter? Yeah. Peter Hames?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, I think we can.
You can?
Yeah,
I would like to say two things. First of all, it is my opinion that the city council needs to be elected by some kind of district as opposed to an at-large system that's in place now. I don't believe there's any accountability that exists now. It's just a beauty contest and name recognition and money being spent as opposed to accountability for performance. Second, I'm really in favor of greater citizen engagement, citizen participation in the city. And it seems to be always overlooked in discussions like this. For development deals, for example, the one coming up on Elm and Liberty, the developer has visited with the community council on occasion, but has not been responsive, which seems very curious, but for the fact that the way the process works here in the city. And it's just as a broad generalization that there is not enough authentic and timely citizen engagement with the city of Cincinnati.
Yeah, Bill, can I weigh in and follow up? This is Janet Buning.
sure.
Can I follow
Yeah,
up on Peter?
certainly.
Okay, I've been a long-term member of the Hyde Park Neighborhood Council and have spent quality time over many administrations, even back to Mr. Newfarmer's time, going down to city council, to city hall to talk about development. And what Peter says is becoming so very true. This is not just from the Hyde Park perspective, but I also attend most of the Invest in Neighborhood gatherings. And I've been to a couple. We had some citywide meetings we were starting to hold before COVID shut everything down. Every community council from Mount Washington to the furthest west out there feels that they're being ignored, that the community has no input into development deals, that it's too far along, promises made, whatever. And I understand that the community is not the only voice in the conversation, but as of right now, I will say from not just my own experience, but hearing from people from Westwood, from Mount Washington, from Avondale, from Bond Hill, everyone, that the community has very little voice in the conversation. And even when we do come down to all the planning commission meetings and all the various committee meetings before council, there's no sense that anything's being listened to. We had a situation in Hyde Park. We had like over 2,000 signatures on a petition for a development deal that frankly is a bad development deal, and it still went sailing through. So Peter is exactly right that when this problem is trying to be solved, somewhere in there needs to be a way that communities have real meaningful access to the process.
Peter, this is Neil Heiberger. I have a question. How many districts would you think would be appropriate for the city the size of Cincinnati?
I'm from St. Paul, and St. Paul's population is right around 320,000. They have 17 district councils.
Do they have any at-large seats as well?
I believe they do. Well, is that city council?
Yes,
No, they're elected by district.
they're all by districts. It's not a
They
mixed
are.
system.
Yeah. Minneapolis has a similar, although they call them wards in Minneapolis.
That's a loaded term. I didn't want to use that.
Yeah, thank you. Me neither.
Bill, I have a
Just
question
make the-
for Mr. Newfarmer.
Oh, good. Okay, Don.
Is there a way that council could take back some of the control that they have forgiven in the past or given up on without having some sort of charter amendment or forcing the mayor to give up some of the power that he has? Could they not instill a new development process which says it has to go through the professionals, and have that written report and advance notice before it ever comes to council?
Don, I don't want to prejudge how to get it done. I think probably it could be done the way you suggest without a charter amendment. But I'm not sure of that. I think that's one of the many things that should be looked at.
Well, that would take the political will to do it.
Well, there are a lot of ideas on the table now, Dale, in terms of doing reform. As I mentioned in passing, Citizen Good Foundation is going to try and take a leadership role in pulling all those things together so that we would have community participation in what these choices are and so on, much like we did the forum a year or two ago. I will make one comment about district. I agree with Peter about accountability. The at-large system does not have individual accountability for council members because it's an at-large contest. But you can establish accountability without districts. You don't have to have districts, you just have to have designated seats. So there are lots of ways to reshape the council if we want to redo the structure. But back to Elizabeth's comments, that we've been tinkering with structure like crazy for a long time, and look where we are. I do think there are a variety of changes that might be considered, and hopefully the current environment is one that will encourage consideration of those kinds of things.
Bill, I have a follow-up for Jerry, if I could.
Sure.
This is Connie Rush from Cincinnati.
Sure.
Jerry, can you give us some more specifics on this Season Good initiative timeline and how civic organizations can become involved in that? Because I think that's a really good idea to kind of get a landscape of what reforms we're talking about.
I think that a request for proposals will be issued by the foundation probably the 1st of next week. And that will be a public document. You'll be able to go on the Season Good website and pick it up if you want.
Catherine, I don't want to leave you out of this. One question I have for you, Catherine, is you want a lot of citizen involvement in these various efforts like redistricting, and you've mentioned some upcoming forum dates and that kind of thing. How can we work with you, the Common Cause and the League of Women Voters and others to get some of these things done, and how best to get local people involved in that?
Yeah, when I said that the rules make it so that things will be better, and I did not mean in any way to suggest any of us should just be sitting on our hands and not working and fighting for fair maps. There are decent rules, but one of the things we know is that the maps will be so much better if we all participate. And so, I would highly encourage you, if you're interested in thinking about community mapping and you're interested in thinking about how it is that you would like Hamilton County District to be drawn, to actually participate in the January 25th training. And it just gives you a taste and a little bit of information, and then you can figure out how to do it. And we can certainly organize something so that, probably hosted by the League of Women Voters of Greater Cincinnati, et cetera, so that we can do a lovely event that really focuses on your communities, really focuses on not just learning how to use the map tools, which is cool, but like figuring out, who wants to do that and who wants to engage people in thinking about what a community, what's a community and where we shouldn't change lines, or where we shouldn't break up areas. And so then when it comes to the dark money, I think we're kind of in this weird holding pattern. And the reason we're in a weird holding pattern is the state legislature is getting itself set up again. When you get to, you have an election, we begin another General Assembly. And so at this point, legislation has not been reintroduced to address the dark money. It will be. The governor does say that at this point he does support it. And so once we actually have that legislation, if you're interested in having us come back, having me come back again, or having somebody from the league talk about, what's going on with that legislation and what we can do to make sure that it actually does what it needs to do. One of the things I would say is when you look at the model kind of legislation, when you look at like what's out there, the Campaign Legal Center is really interested in working with communities. So is the Brennan Center for Justice, to say, okay, we know there's dark money. Most of us think about it as in the presidential race or Congress, but we know that it's infiltrating into, city races and county races. And so If you're interested in that, I can connect you all with some really good resources so that you can figure out what's the best for you. Because, it's like every kind of solution, you need to tweak it so that it's right for the area that's intended for.
Great. We're reaching the end of our time here. Any last minute questions or commentary by our speakers? Comments from our speakers?
Bill, thank you for the opportunity to join you today and have this conversation.
Well, this is good, and obviously this is a beginning, and we're going to have to continue with this on both the state and the local level. And so hopefully we've got some good people, and the comments you made about the Season Good Foundation, I think we can help you assemble that just with one of these Zoom forums. So let's follow up from there. But it's good to see you all, and Happy New Year. And we will, I think, is former Congressman and Mayor Mann still with us? He's going to
Yes,
join
he
us 2 weeks.
I am.
He's going to join us 2 weeks from today with someone from the county to talk about other county and city issues. So come back for that 2 weeks from today. So thank you all for getting us started in 2021. See you.
Thank you to our speakers. They were all excellent.
Right.
Then-
Yes.